Welcome to Into Theology. I'm joined today, as always, with the handsome and wonderful Ian Clary, and also the more handsome and more wonderful Matthew Hoskin. Preeminently so. We have to pull apart any kind of creaturely implications. We invited Matthew this week, as we did Gavin last week, to kind of continue a discussion about Augustine. Ian and I finished all 13 books of Confessions. And I think we both felt, or at least I felt, like I'm still kind of dumb about Augustine, and it's useful to just kind of broaden our mind on certain things. So Gavin is more theological. I suspect today we'll talk more about the classical world just in general, but I guess we'll see how that goes. However, we would love for you, Matthew, just to briefly introduce yourself. So why don't you give the 27-second version of who you are and where you've been, and then we'll ask you some questions. 27 exactly.
Right. 27 exactly. I'm Matthew Hoskin. I am a native of Canada from Alberta.
Yeah, you are.
Currently live in the freezing city of Thunder Bay on the north shore of Lake Superior, son of an Anglican priest, raised in the evangelical charismatic wing of that. And I have a PhD from the University of Edinburgh, where I studied the manuscripts of Pope Leo the Great's letters. He was Bishop of Rome from 440 to 461, and I got to hang out with about 300 manuscripts. That came out as a book version of that back in March. And I currently teach for Davenant Hall, where I teach mostly patristics. Sometimes I edge into medieval. And I am also going to be starting to teach at Ryle Seminary in Ottawa, starting in January. So that's maybe the 27-second tour of me very quickly.
So what is it you're doing in Thunder Bay then right now?
So I moved to Thunder Bay for a job opportunity that got killed off by pandemic restrictions and their inability to pay me as a result. So now this is where I am. I did live in Thunder Bay in high school, and so that's how I sort of got the opportunity, was through some old friends and things. So, but the beauty of having an army of friends and the internet is that I can still teach for 2 different seminaries on the internet. So it's pretty great.
Yeah, I first heard of this through the Davenant world. I think all 3 of us have connection now with the Davenant Institute, and so I see that you've taught courses like you've actually taught one on what we're going to be talking about today. We're looking at Augustine, and so it looks like you did one, you did one in 2021 on Augustine's kind of major writings. What do you have coming up for Davenant?
Coming up in January, I'll be teaching the theological world of the Nicene controversy. So it's going to start at sort of 425 with the Council of Nicaea, called by Constantine to deal with a guy called Arius who was trying to teach that Jesus was a creation, basically. And it's going to run through the Arius guy. Who is that? And running through up to 407 with the death of St. John Chrysostom, who was the Golden Mouth, one of the greatest preachers of the Greek Church.
Yeah.
And looking at both how do we come to articulate the Trinity and sort of its glorious beauty in St. Gregory of Nazianzus in the late 300s, but also what are the other theological things that are going on at the same time, sort of bring in that wider context. Is sometimes you laser in too much in this kind of course and forget that some of the things that later councils in the 5th and 6th centuries talk about are already being talked about at the same time. And so trying to bring all of this together in one course.
So where did you go to school? So you went to Edinburgh. Who did you study with at Edinburgh?
I studied with Sarah Parvis in divinity and Gavin Kelly in classics. So I got a twofer.
Okay. And then where did you do, did you undergrad and master's work in Canada or?
Yes, yeah. So my undergrad was at the University of Ottawa, where I did classical studies. And then I did an MA in classics at U of T at the University of Toronto before hopping over to do a second Master's of Theology in Edinburgh.
Okay. So when you were in Toronto then, where'd you go to church? Because I lived in Toronto for 15 years, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I went to Little Trinity.
Okay.
While I was there, which was 2007, 8, 9. I was in Toronto.
Sorry, my phone's going off here.
So I have an important question.
Okay, go for it.
Leo, is he correct on Christology?
Oh, gosh.
Yes. So
I
there
thought
we
he
go.
wants isn't he basically just arguing for an Nestorian separation of the two natures without any kind of union? Didn't Cyril get it right?
So Leo also got it right. So what Leo gives us, so the criticism that comes even from R.W. Jensen is that in the phrase agat enim utraque forma, in Leo's most famous Christological thing, and that is, I realize that's a Latin phrase, it's this whole passage that begins, each form performs what is proper to itself. And so people like Severus of Antioch, who is this anti-Chalcedonian guy in the early 500s, right through to today, critics of Leo say, actually, Jensen goes so far as to say that if this isn't Nestorianism, it's worse, is actually what he says, which I think is just a misreading of the text. Because the point is that, Leo is doing out loud what Cyril says you're allowed to do in your head. Like St. Cyril says, obviously in your mind, this is how you prove he's both human and divine. But when you say out loud, you always just predicate it of the God word. But the problem with that after Cyril's death is that there are people like this Archimandrite Eutyches, who's like a fancy monk in Constantinople, start saying things where basically the humanity is being completely swallowed up by the divinity. And so you need to start actually articulating more clearly those things that are evidence for the full properties of both natures existing together. And so that's what Leo does for us. And Leo's Christology also, if Leo's wrong about Christology, so is the entire Latin tradition before him, because he basically just recapitulates them for a new context. He is basically Augustine, Hilary, and Ambrose synthesized into one short document.
There you go.
So,
well, we're okay with Leo, Gregory the Great, but after there's no more good popes after Gregory the Great, right? Isn't that what Calvin says? I can't remember. Or maybe Vermigli or someone says that. I can't remember. That's when it ends for Protestants. Nothing else happens as useful.
I got to interject here.
Oh,
so my computer just sent me a notification saying that it's going to do an update in 5 minutes.
You can't just pause it.
I don't know.
Yeah, it'll just click the pause button. We'll figure it out. If not, Matthew and I will have a great conversation.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Well, we'll let Ian work out his technological issues today.
Super annoying.
As he does. So okay, I'll start. I'm gonna ask you a question, and we can maybe just figure out where to go from there.
Oh, I did it. I fixed it. I think I fixed it.
Thanks for the announcement.
I'm here. No, this has freaked me out. So, joys of recording live on stupid technology.
I'm not editing this, just so you know.
I'm
extremely happy
raw
to show off your Luddite ways.
There you go.
Okay, so Augustine, he lives in the mid to late 300s, dies was it 430 or something like that. So he's right before Leo. He's kind of a little bit older than the Cappadocians, but they would have overlapped a little bit. I guess he would technically be alive when Athanasius was alive a little bit, right at the beginning, before he's really a full Christian. So how do we situate him among his peers, and what's happening in North Africa at this time? It's a province of Rome, but like, what is it? What is that place?
Right. Well, lots of things. So situating Augustine among his peers is actually, guys like Augustine are part of this privileged group, privileged by providence, privileged group of theologians who get to live beyond the First Council of Constantinople, when basically within the Church of the Roman Empire, Arianism was done. And so then that means that people like Leo and the last years of Ambrose and a certain portion, about 10 years of St. Gregory of Nyssa, they get to devote their energy to other theological questions than the question of the divinity of the Son and the Spirit in relation to the Father. So that means that he is able to turn to some really important things to do with the providence of God. And it's also this interesting gap between ecumenical councils, when everyone sort of starts to get caught up in whatever the moment of the day is, when people are having other little smaller fights along the way. And so Augustine is able to articulate a Christology to both pagans and Christians and all these things in a way that is not worrying about defending any of the church councils or anything, but simply about explicating orthodoxy as he understands it. So he sort of is in this, most of his career exists in this beautiful moment, alongside Jerome, who is out trying to make new controversies, but both of them are around the same time as each other. They're florid.
It's an interesting way to put it, because you're right. I mean, the next big controversies are like Chalcedon and Orange and so on after that, and they're not. Yeah, it really is an interesting. But I would even almost, well, I guess you said this, even like the Cappadocians, they're almost in that same period too, between Nicaea and Constantinople, 325 and 381, where yeah, there are some debates happening. They're really important, eunomias and so on, but they're almost able to say, we already kind of believe this. Let's work it out. Let's work out our worship. And I think that might be one of the part of the reasons why their writings are so perennial, so useful, so unendingly helpful to us today, because it's almost a positive presentation of what's going on, despite the fact there are a lot of disagreements. Okay, so that's him. So can you just name people who are alive around when he's alive, like emperors and popes and bishops? Because I think sometimes you hear like Augustine and you forget, like, oh, Ambrose and Jerome are also, or Rufinus, or like these guys are all around each other. Even like Chrysostom's are alive at the same time, right? Like, but we don't think about that. You just think they're like discrete people.
Yeah. So Augustine, it's actually really interesting to think about. He is in Rome at the same time as Donatus, who is actually one of the most famous late antique grammarians and teachers of rhetoric. And then he goes up to Milan at the same time as Ambrose, who is one of the most famous orators, who goes off and becomes a bishop. So he's even in the same city at the same time as some of the other famous guys. And in fact, Jerome himself was a student of Donatus before he went off to become a monk. Yeah, so Jerome is also a trained rhetorician, trained orator, which is very obvious if you read him. So, and in terms of emperors, Augustine, his main period of flourishing is the end of Emperor Theodosius the Great, who sort of, what can we say about Theodosius? He regathers together under a single dude for a bit all of the official auctoritas of the Roman emperor under one guy. But then he does the normal thing of having two sons and giving it to each of them in 395. So then you have these two less awesome emperors after him, his sons. Honorius in the west, Arcadius in the east. Arcadius is the guy whose wife gets Chrysostom exiled unto death. Right. So that's sort of what he's famous for in ecclesiastical history. And and Honorius actually there's a fascinating letter that Honorius writes to Arcadius about that, because there's like riots in Constantinople over this. And Honorius says, and some other stuff to do with the empress. And Honorius says that this isn't your job as emperor. Your job is not to depose and exile bishops. This is just causing all sorts of unrest, and you should keep out of that kind of affair, which is sort of shows a slightly different attitude in terms of the relationship between the magistrate and the church, between East and West. Anyway, so that's just cool stuff that I know. Who else is alive? Chrysostom. Oh, the tail end of some of the famous Desert Fathers. This is the other thing I was trying to think about. Mm-hmm. So Antony probably dies around the same time St. Augustine is born, but then guys like Evagrius of Pontus is around at the same time. And then John Cassian, who sort of spends all that time in the desert. And actually some of what Cassian's doing is responding to the whole Pelagian crisis that Augustine is famous for, and trying to come up with a way of being true to the instincts of Augustine about the necessity of grace, but also that feeling that we have that somehow humans need to be held responsible. And so he's not theologically as good at it as Augustine. He gets into lots of trouble by a guy called Prosper, but you can sort of see he is still within the bounds of orthodoxy, despite what some of his later detractors might say. I'm a fan of Cassian. Even if I end up siding with Augustine because of the logic of the situation, I get where he's trying to go.
It's the so-called semi-Pelagian controversy.
So
right?
Yes,
it's so-called being like
so-called. Yeah.
And Pelagius, isn't he from like Ireland or something, if I remember this right? Then he goes to like
Britannia.
Britannia. Yeah. He goes to Rome, and actually it's been pointed out that we overemphasize like it's like this. That's just like a random biographical fact that he's from Britain. The Pelagian drive is common to like a lot of monastics and common to a lot of people coming out of Rome at that time. And so to try to imagine that it's part of some sort of particular special instinct of the Celtic world, which is what some people do with it, is to miss the fact that it's actually part of Latin-speaking culture in late antiquity.
I think it's part of
that'll explain why like Celestius or Julian or whatever can pick up on it too, right? Like they're that sort of background.
I think it's part of Ian Clary's psychos too, because he's Irish in background. I think he's a bit of a semi-Pelagian, actually.
Well,
I mean that seems like a good judgment to make on the basis of all this evidence. This might be a dumb question.
My wife is from Wales, and I like to tease her that he's from Wales, and so all the Welsh Pelagians.
This is probably a dumb question, but there seems to be always, at least there still is today, but in the early church world, you have these kind of really strict movements like Novatian in Rome in the 200s or so. The Donatists have certain strictures. Is Pelagius just kind of a part of one of these movements that's just like, it's almost like a pendulum swing where things get too loose and he's really trying to get back to whatever a stricter form of Christianity? Is that just like maybe a broader way to describe who he is and what he's doing? Or is he really unique?
I would say that is a really good way of describing what Pelagius is doing. If you think what he and then his later supporters like Julian of Eclanum are saying, it's a strictly rigorous and moralist vision. It's not, if you read, I don't know, pop Pelagianism on the internet today, it's all about we have this endued ability to just be good in and of ourselves. And like, do you realize what goodness means to these guys? Like, these are the guys there is no hope for you if you start thinking too hard about this. If it's all up to me and you look at the moral standards of the Bible, then you're out. But one of the ways that I would say you're definitely right about this is that at the same time as Pelagius, there is in the Eastern Church, going on a group called the Massalians, and much of their teaching is very similar to his. And the primary thing that they start off with is moral rigorism. And they believe that you can and should, all of your own accord, be able to become holy. And they say things like baptism does nothing. It's all about morality. The Holy Communion does nothing. It's all about morality. And so they get targeted by a guy called Mark the Monk, who actually says,
that's a great name.
That's awesome. Mark the Monk. I like it.
Mark the Monk. It's like, that's not very specific. Which, anyway.
It's like a Monty Python character. It's like...
Yeah. Ongoing academic debates as to which monk named Mark is this Mark the Monk. But he has some really good things to say that sound very much like Augustine in response to Massalians that are equally applicable to Pelagians.
Well, it seems like a regular perennial thing. I mean, you think of like the English Reformation. After a while, some independents felt like the state church at that time was too loose. They're more rigorous. It just seems like a common pull that goes back and forth in church history. And sometimes I think if you think of a guy like Pelagius, you just think he's like this unique, singular individual who comes and rides on a horse from Britannia and enters into the world and starts a new movement. It's not quite right.
Did you know that he's was part of Arthurian legend?
No, but go on.
So I'm pulling this totally from Hollywood, but do you know the Clive Owen film about Arthur?
Is that the new one?
It's like, but it's like set in the Roman Empire. It's like 10, 15 years old or whatever. And then there's a character in there that's a monk named Pelagius who comes from Britannia. And it's got to be the same guy.
It's in
a movie.
The 100, no, how many years? No, it's decades, isn't not 100 years anyway.
Yeah.
So actually the event, so here's the fun facts about the later and post-Roman world is that, so because when a heretic comes from somewhere, you accuse everyone who lives there of that heresy. So like Spaniards will spend the rest of late antiquity and Middle Ages of being accused of being Priscillianists because of the guy Priscillian of Avila. And so the British will spend the rest of probably forever, they probably are to this day accused of being Pelagians. And so then this guy Germanus of Auxerre, who is a character in that film, comes over in the 450s, 440s, 450s to deal with this outbreak of Pelagianism back in Britain. And so he comes and they hold a little council, and he, through his humility, simplicity of speech, as opposed to the Pelagians who are all fancied up, and they're just sophists, basically. He sort of wins over the populace, and there's a triumph of orthodoxy.
Wow,
So,
cool.
yeah.
Am I not right to say that Martin of Tours is just right after Augustine? Like he's similar. She's late 400s, isn't he?
Martin of Tours is about the same time as Augustine. He's like, he probably dies, is it 380 or 390? Because he is a soldier in the service of the Emperor Julian, who
right,
while Julian is
Julian.
It would have been against Julian.
Sorry, I mean Augustine has a book called Against Julian. So
yes.
Yeah.
So this is that very Julian, who rejects Christianity. And when he becomes emperor publicly, he rejects Christianity in 361. And so Martin, when Julian was Caesar, which is like junior emperor in Gaul, which is modern France, in like the late 350s, Martin was serving under there. But he had a case of conscience while serving in the army, that as a Christian, maybe he shouldn't be running around, just killing off Alemanni and burning their houses and stuff, which is what Julian was famous for doing. So he left and became a monk instead. And his feast day is on Remembrance Day, which I always think is
easy to remember.
Confluence.
The day that Martin Luther was baptized too.
Oh.
So that's why his name is Martin. So we're kind of framing him in terms of these characters and these various figures from history, and we typically describe the period of time as late antiquity, which seems, in a sense, like I don't know. Do you take it as a kind of like a made up term to just try to frame an era? And like, how do you see what late antiquity really is, and like what are like some key defining features?
Yeah, so there is a way in which late antiquity is kind of made up. It's not that it's a bad thing, but it's an attempt by cultural historians like Peter Brown, who's like really good. So not dissing on Peter Brown here,
no,
but trying to find things that make sort of this period of sort of the later Roman Empire into the early Middle Ages. What are the things that actually make it distinct and unique and tie it together in a cultural sense? So, which makes it much looser and much harder, because he, in his book, The World of Late Antiquity, actually pushes the beginning to like Marcus Aurelius, which I think is like a little bit insane, if you ask me. But someone pointed out when I tried once to be like, well, let's just do later Roman Empire, and so like cut off, like say 400 or Justinian or something. And someone pointed out, but like culturally, Constantine is more like Augustus than Justinian is like Constantine. Like so much like, so why would we group these people together but not these people, right? Because cultural change is always over a continuum. So the end dates always end up being a bit arbitrary.
Yeah.
So
what are some defining features? Like what are some of those cultural things that kind of like give shape to it then, and that really forms the backdrop to Augustine's world?
I would say something that it's hard to articulate well, but the emergence of what we might call the individual, which is why Peter Brown says Marcus Aurelius is the first late antique person, because
like
of the
inner citadel sort of thing.
Yeah, that sort of thing. And part of this, I would say perhaps actually the emergence of the person as opposed to the individual, because a lot of Greek and Roman philosophy tends towards monism at some stage. But now I alone, if I'm doing like say Plotinus, well, you had Caleb Coho on before, so you've talked about this on this show. So like if you're doing sort of Plotinian mysticism or whatever, you alone can reach upwards towards whatever the divine is, the good, the true, and the beautiful. Whereas previously, sort of traditional Greek and Roman stuff, you meet the gods by going to a sacrifice and eating the sacrificial meat, or burning incense back at home to the lares and the penates at your household shrine. In late antiquity, it's like, but I alone, independent of all of that formal culture, am now actually becoming more introspective. And you're starting to think about what is a person, and which is what the Cappadocians, through looking at what the Trinity, how do you articulate who the members of the Trinity are, sort of realize that a person is an individual, but it's an individual who is in specific relation to others, which is how we are a very poor analogy for the Trinity. I'm not going to go all social Trinity on you here because I don't think it's a good idea.
We'll throw down if you do.
So, but God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are only understood but as being different in terms of relations. That's how the distinction is made without making an actual difference, right? How they have a single Lucia. And so then when you start thinking about that being at some level is communion, which is, I'm stealing the title of the book by John Zizioulas there. For those who don't read Orthodox theologians.
Careful.
But even though I don't actually go in for all of his interpretations of the Cappadocians, that book actually has a good point that the knock-on effects of this for us, in terms of how we start looking at other persons, are important for the development of human psychology, and all these things are emerging partly as a result of this deep meditation on the Trinity in the 4th century, which we see, I say Augustine is the fruit of that.
Augustine.
So in the sense of like, so Philip Carey has his book, Augustine, the invention of the inner self. So going back to us in the last number of months working through confessions, is that kind of like a primary example in terms of texts that would illustrate that? Then that here's the individual, and the individual before God, and all of his psychological turmoil.
Yes, yeah, exactly. I think that confession sort of is one of our key texts for showing what this sort of emergence of the individual person is and what it looks like for culture and for theology and introspection and all that. I keep on thinking of it as a memory palace in Confessions, where he has all of that, the ability to start thinking about memory in that way. Like Augustine is doing philosophy and doing theology in himself with God, whereas the older tradition of Plato is Plato is always removed. He's never a character in his own dialogue, right? It's always Socrates. And even if Socrates says it, doesn't mean Plato believes it, right? So whereas Augustine is himself, he is the main character of the narrative of his own personal theology and philosophy, which I think is something very different.
Yeah. So is the culture shaping Augustine this way? Like, is this something he's coming to his own self, or is that late antique world where that is a kind of like that individual kind of defining theme? Is that driving him this way, or is this kind of like maybe in a sense he's driving it too? I don't know.
I think in a sense he's one of these people he's one of these brilliant minds who is going to be pushing through and doing new, exciting, interesting things. So he's doing something no one else does or will do for ages in Confessions. And so doing theology in this way, he sort of is maybe not necessarily doing it directly through the wider culture around him, but we do know that it's not that he's not ignorant of what's going on with the Greek fathers, though, right? His contemporaries. And so that his meditating on those texts of the Cappadocians and of Athanasius, we know he definitely read Athanasius, I think it could be shaping him to be able to start doing more introspection because of that, or because of reading things like the Life of Antony as well, which we know he read. So
is that sorry, one more question then, because you got me thinking.
I don't think you're allowed to ask one more question.
God. So then is the rise of you got Constantine, then you get a kind of a push as the church starts to change and becomes more kind of like the culture. So then you get a rise of monasticism that'll kind of come out of that as a bit of a reaction. Is monasticism an important backdrop then to that rise of a kind of discovery of the self? So you're noting that there's the Cappadocian fathers, but then you have like the desert fathers who are going out and being their own individual selves, and then their writings or there's the stories about them are then permeating in the church and in the culture. So is monasticism actually a kind of like a backdrop to that move in late antiquity?
I would say it definitely is. And I think that's sort of and this is the thing that actually distinguishes the Desert Fathers from previous experiments in Christian asceticism, is they leave. So if you read the life of Antony or the lives of any of the early guys like St. Pachomius, who's a bit later than Antony in terms of when he starts, but they like die around the same time. before they go out, they actually are staying with local Christian ascetics in the town and in the city. What makes them different is they're leaving that integrated social world of the village, of the polis, and sort of if we start thinking like Plato and Aristotle, they actually leave behind that and go off into the wilderness to do nothing but meet with God and fight demons. And so their ascesis is much more individualized and much more distinct from the wider world around them than that would have been promoted by Clement of Alexandria or something like that about 100 years before.
You should expand on the idea of the polis, because I think if you live today, we just have different categories that might make it hard to understand what that means.
Sure. So, I mean, the polis, it's a Greek word for city, but it's not just like, it's more than just a city, even geographically speaking. A polis would be what we would actually often term a city-state in its like oldest Greekist form. So sort of the polis of Athens, Greekist. Yeah. And so the polis of Athens is not just the city of Athens that we would think of in terms of urban buildup, but also the whole region of Attica, which surrounds it, where there are like wheat fields and all sorts of things down to the Piraeus on the coast. But the polis itself is also the place where obviously what we would call politics takes place. And so then, and this is actually what distinguishes civilization itself from whatever it was Adam and Eve were up to, whatever our ancestors were doing before they built cities, is it is a gathering of people for the common purpose of living well together, basically, which results in a differentiation of labor. So you end up with, rather than everyone just being like, I'm a farmer or I'm a hunter and a gatherer, you start being like, I'm a potter, because there are farmers who do other stuff, because we have large enough grain yields with civilization and everyone cooperating. So it's the creation of cooperative society, which therefore leads to the creation of laws, because people don't always get along, right? And so a polis in one sense is just a city, but a city itself means civilization. And it's this cooperative society of people with differentiated roles working together, governed by laws, and obviously different constitutions will govern different cities. So
leaving the polis is leaving, in essence, civilization for something quite different. It might be interesting too to note, like, you have these ascetics or whatever, they go off. There's some that are in cities, but mostly they go out, or well, I guess different kinds. How does that relate? Because there is also a lot of secular, or that's the wrong word, a lot of non-Christian similarities between, say, mystical Platonists or something like that, who will do a lot of this contemplation. And like, so how are they different? How is a monk different than a Platonist?
Well, I think one of the things Augustine actually shows us this in Confessions, that he actually does this sort of Neoplatonist, Plotinian mysticism stuff, right? You're trying to empty yourself and reach up towards the one or whatever. But it's not until he's a baptized Christian and member of the Society of the Church that he finds what it was that he was looking for in that Platonic moment. And this is what I say, whether we're thinking like late antique Platonist stuff, or what I sort of, some of these westernized versions of sort of Buddhist or Hindu meditative practice. So I don't know enough about Buddhism and Hinduism themselves to know how closely what people I've met do, but these things where you're just trying to empty yourself or reach towards an almost unknown God, in the Christian meditative practice of people like the Desert Fathers, you're not really emptying yourself so much as making room for God to fill yourself. So if you're clearing your mind to focus your mind on God and on the Psalms mostly as well. So it's very text-based as well, I guess, is another thing that would differentiate what they're up to and make them different, is that they're meditating over the Psalms and singing the Psalms and seeking God there. So that's, I say, one of the main distinctions between, say, the Desert Fathers and a Platonic Platonist counterpart.
That's super helpful. How do you see then, like, this period as it will move? So we've kind of looked at, late antiquity in relation to earlier periods of time in the classical world, patristics. How is it in terms of its influence, and especially with Augustine going into like the early Middle Ages and then on down the line? Because it seems like it's this weird transition period, right, from the classical world to the early Middle Ages, and it's kind of amorphous in where you situate it. So you think of like maybe even somebody like a Boethius or some of the others that are after him. Like, where does that influence lie?
Yeah, this is actually, of course, what you've just pointed out is one of the things that makes late antiquity so cool, is that it is this transitioning period. That's why guys like Peter Brown try to make it more than just later Roman Empire, early Middle Ages, but instead see this flow from one stage of culture to another. And so a lot of what these guys do, especially Boethius, Cassiodorus, and even some of the monastic writers like John Cassian, is they're taking this wisdom that is coming at them from behind, or even the literature guys are doing it. Servius does it with like sort of Virgil and stuff, and they take this whole depositive culture and they create something that is reflective back on the classical past and transmitting it forward into this new world. Because in late antiquity, there's also an awareness that you're in a world grown old and that you're not living the golden age of Augustus or the golden age of Plato anymore. And so then you're trying to retrieve the best of what came before you to pass it on to what follows. So what this does is the tastes of late antique men are what govern the access to the classical world of the Middle Ages. Partly because one of the major cultural things they're doing is making the Codex book, a book with pages bound on one spine. So the 4th and 5th centuries is really when that takes off as a way to make a book. It has obvious benefits over a scroll. And so everything that predates the transfer from a scroll in papyrus to a codex with either papyrus or parchment, it doesn't last unless it's in like Egypt or Syria where it's really dry, because it's just going to rot. And so that means that the stuff these guys really wanted to keep is the stuff that the Middle Ages gets and recopies and reads over and over. And the stuff they were less interested in doesn't make the cut, because making a book is expensive. And so part of how they influence it is when you read these medieval guys, what they think of as being like Greek philosophy is really what Boethius thinks of as Greek philosophy. And when you see what they're doing with poetry, well, they don't have access to Ennius anymore, who is like the great Roman poet from before Virgil. He's like, Virgil supplants him so totally that guys in the 300s and 400s, they're reading Ennius, they're commenting on Ennius, but they're copying Virgil. And we have 4th century copies of Virgil, illustrated prestige copy, more than one, multiples, and we have 0 of Ennius.
Wow.
And so it completely shapes the way all of us to this day look back. This funnel from scroll to codex completely changes to this day the way we look at the classical world, because what survives, like all those extra books of Livy, people are like, I'm tired of Livy, and they just didn't do it. So,
you know what that reminds me of? In our time, Banner of Truth Trust published a lot of Puritan books, but they published the Puritan books that they were interested in or who were part of a specific Puritan stream. So a lot of people, when you think of the Puritans, just think of that singular puritanical stream and not necessarily the richer diversity of the Puritans who were not always in the same stream that Banner of Truth Trust published. And so it's good that Banner of Truth did that. It's not a bad thing, but it creates a sort of accidental misunderstanding of who the Puritans are and what they believed, and the diversity of their expression and how they disagreed with one another. How many Puritans were Remainers. They weren't all leavers of the
Brexit.
They didn't all go on Brexit.
Their own Brexit.
Take a boat over to the colonies to create a nation on the basis of rebellion against proper authority.
It's in a room here, so we're all, this is good.
Oh,
stuff.
actually, we're all Canadians. Yeah.
Yeah, we are. So we're like, yeah.
Oh, wait.
Nobody's offended here.
Matthew, are you a Tory too? You're a Tory, right?
I'm a Tory, yeah.
We're one of. There's only 4 of us in Canada, and there's 3 on this.
Who's the other one? Oh, Ron Dart.
Well, Rod Dart, and actually, isn't the 5th one? There's a priest. I won't say his name on the podcast, not just in case, but he's another priest that I know. Moving on to the east now, or in the east now. So, yeah. Okay, there's 5 Tories in Canada, so we're about to take over.
That's
There we
great.
go.
Yeah. After Pierre gets to be PM, we'll get elected next. I'm sure our party,
That's
so
right.
we're fine.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this gets to work. I think we're getting close to the end of our time. Ian, do you have anything that's like just
The
really
one I
pressing?
want to
Yeah.
I think so tying it into moving away kind of more from the socio-historical to like more really even in a sense theological or spiritual. What is Augustine's influence then? You know, as he himself is then becoming like the dominant figure coming out of late antiquity into the Middle Ages. Like, what are the major streams of his influence, do you think?
So Augustine is major for the doctrine of the Trinity on the one hand. I'm working my way through Peter Lombard's Sentences, which are like the scholastic textbook, and I'm in book 1 about the Trinity. It's almost all Augustine and trying to sort through what Augustine teaches on the Holy Trinity. So he continues that. He is also famous for, as we all today, when you say Augustinian, you don't mean his doctrine of the Trinity, you usually mean predestination.
Yeah.
And that is his major that is his major particular thing that sort of distinguishes him maybe from some other thinkers. And you can actually find it. I was thinking about ways that Augustine is so influential. If you go through the collects of the Book of Common Prayer, most of them they're actually late antique. And you can find Augustinian teachings about grace and free will hidden in the prayer book collects, which is just beautiful and really cool.
Are you a 1662 guy?
So, I have my 1962 prayer book from the Anglican Church of Canada.
Oh,
I do own 1662 somewhere.
somewhere. He doesn't even know where it is on the shelf.
Don't even know where it is. Okay, I have the annotated 1662 at home on the shelf with my other pretty looking books. So
My unread pretty books.
My unread. Well, it's where my Richard Hooker is, so it's not entirely unread. That shelf of pretty books.
How does Confessions? How about Confessions itself? Like, how does that get picked up in the Middle Ages?
So Confessions in the Middle Ages, not a bestseller.
Wow.
So it's funny from the early modern period, from like the 1500s with like Teresa of Avila onwards, hot stuff. Like we're all reading this. Rousseau's reading it and coming with his own weird romanticism version of it. But in the Middle Ages, they're like, you know what we like? We like De Doctrina Christiana because it's a handbook for preachers. And that's his most popular work of the Middle Ages, not Confessions. So, and I mean, you can tell, I say that if you read some Cistercians and things, you will actually find, like William of Saint-Thierry or Guillaume de Saint-Thierry, his meditations are influenced by meditative aspects of Confessions, but it's a fairly thin thread of influence through the Middle Ages. Interestingly.
Cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, Matthew, I think it was a pleasure to chat with you about Augustine.
It feels like we've been talking for 5 minutes, honestly.
This has been great.
Yeah.
Well, we can do it again. We could talk about
we're gonna do Aquinas
or Hooker or Aquinas or something like that again. Yeah, we're gonna do Aquinas next for our podcast. So we can maybe find a way to get you back on and we'll put in the show notes links to how to register to both your classes at Ryle and at Davenant Institute.
Great. Thanks.
I think it's still open registration probably until January for both, I think. So anywho, we'll get that in there. But yeah, it was fun to talk to you. I think sometimes hearing the big picture can really make authors come alive. Like just to know that like Chrysostom was alive at the same time. I know a bit off in terms of years, but like it just kind of like helps you think, oh yeah, the world's bigger. Like that was just happening right across that little bit of river between Augustine and Chrysostom. So anyways, cool stuff. I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on, friend.
Thank you. Yeah, that was great.
Thank you.